My name is Maren Voss. I'm 34 years old, and I spend my days finding money that other people think is hidden well enough to never be found. I'm a certified fraud examiner for a regional bank, which means when a loan officer gets a bad feeling about a file, it lands on my desk. I have found forged signatures under a microscope light. I have traced shell companies through 6 states and 2 countries. I have testified in federal court and watched a man's hands shake when I read his own falsified numbers back to him in his own words. So when my father called me stupid, called me the dumbest child he ever raised, in front of my brother, my mother, and a caterer he hadn't even paid yet, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I clicked my pen 4 times, the way I always do right before I say something that matters, and I said, okay, that was it. Just, okay. He thought he'd won. He thought a 59-year-old man in a golf polo had just put his daughter in her place at her own family's dinner table. He had no idea that 3 months later, he would be sitting in the waiting room outside my office, holding a manila folder against his chest like a shield, waiting for me to save the same company he'd just told me I was too stupid to understand. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the part he doesn't know I know. The part that starts with a power of attorney form, he had me sign when I was 26 years old for what he swore on my mother's life, was a simple real estate favor. Welcome back to Calm Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out the other side with their dignity, and sometimes a little more, intact. If you've ever been the competent one, the fixer, the one everyone calls when something breaks and nobody calls when something good happens, this story is for you. Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever been the responsible one in your family. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. But let me back up. 8 years, to be exact, to the summer I turned 26, the summer everything that happened later was quietly set into motion, though none of us knew it yet. I grew up in Marion Falls, a mid-sized town built mostly around lumber, concrete, and the kind of family businesses that get passed down like heirlooms, whether or not the next generation actually wants them. My father, Gerald Voss, built Voss Building Supply from a single flatbed truck into a 2-location distributor that outfitted half the contractors in 3 counties. He was proud of that. He should have been proud of that. What he wasn't proud of, not once, not one single time in my entire life, was me. I was the daughter who read the fine print. I was the daughter who asked, at 14 years old, why the company's insurance renewal letter had 2 different premium numbers on 2 different pages. My father laughed. He called me the little auditor at the dinner table, and not in a way that sounded like a compliment. My younger brother, Connor, 3 years behind me, was the one who got taken to the yard on Saturdays, taught to drive the forklift before he could legally drive a car, introduced to every supplier rep with the words, "This one's going to run the place someday." Nobody ever said that about me. Nobody ever needed to. It was understood the way weather is understood. Some things you don't argue with. I remember one incident specifically because it's the one I go back to when people ask me when I first understood my place in that house. I was 12. I'd entered the regional science fair with a project on soil erosion rates around the creek behind our property. Real data, 6 weeks of measurements, a spreadsheet I'd built by hand because we didn't have a home computer that could run anything fancier. I won 2nd place in the county. My father came to the awards ceremony. He shook the judge's hand, told him, "She gets that from her mother's side," which wasn't even true. My mother has never once balanced a checkbook in her life. And then, in the car on the way home, he spent the entire 20-minute drive talking about how Connor's Pinewood Derby car, which had placed nowhere, had real craftsmanship in it. I didn't say anything. I looked out the window and did math in my head, the way I always did when I needed somewhere quiet to put my attention. That was the year I stopped bringing my report cards to the dinner table unless someone asked, because nobody ever asked. By high school, the pattern had a shape I could predict before it happened. If Connor forgot his homework, my father called it a busy kid with a lot going on. If I forgot mine, once, in 11 years of school, my father asked me at dinner if I was starting to slip, in a tone that suggested slipping was a moral failing rather than a Tuesday. I got a full academic scholarship offer to a state school 2 hours from home. My father's response was to ask whether it was one of the real ones, as though a scholarship built entirely on transcripts and test scores might turn out to be some kind of participation trophy if he looked closely enough. Connor's acceptance into the same school, a year later, on no scholarship at all, tuition paid in full without a single question asked, was celebrated with a cookout that lasted into the evening. I wasn't being paranoid. I want to be clear about that, because for years I second-guessed my own read of these moments, wondered if I was building a case against my father, the way I'd eventually build cases against strangers for a living, cherry-picking evidence to support a conclusion I'd already reached. But patterns aren't paranoia. Patterns are just patterns. You only call them paranoia when you're the one benefiting from nobody naming them out loud. I want to tell you what I actually do for a living, in a little more detail, because I think it matters to understanding how this story ends. When a loan officer at my bank gets a feeling, a small itch that a borrower's file doesn't add up the way it should, they escalate it to my team. We pull bank statements, cross-reference vendor invoices against delivery logs, trace wire transfers through intermediary accounts, and build, piece by piece, a picture of what actually happened versus what someone wanted the paperwork to say happened. I once spent 4 months reconstructing how a regional trucking company had been quietly overbilling a municipal contract by falsifying mileage logs, a case that ended with a criminal referral and a restitution order north of $800,000. I don't say this to brag. I say it because it's the exact skill set, applied without sentiment, without an off switch for family, that would eventually turn on my own father's paperwork the same way it had turned on strangers dozens of times before. I didn't go into the family business. I went to state school on a partial scholarship, waited tables to cover the rest, and majored in accounting because numbers didn't lie to me the way people in my family did. When I told my father I'd been accepted into a fraud examination certification program after graduation, he looked at me across the kitchen table, put down his coffee, and said, "So you want to spend your life catching other people's mistakes instead of building something of your own?" I remember that sentence exactly. I remember it because it was the first time I understood that in my father's mind, competence that didn't serve him wasn't competence at all. It was just an inconvenience with a diploma. Here's the family motto, the phrase I heard more times growing up than I heard my own name. Family takes care of family. Gerald Voss said it at every holiday, every crisis, every time someone needed something from someone else. It sounded warm. It sounded like the kind of thing you'd cross-stitch onto a pillow. What it actually meant, what it always meant, was this. When Connor needed something, family took care of Connor. When I needed something, family reminded me that needing things was for people who hadn't figured out how to take care of themselves. I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story about a monster. My father wasn't cruel in dramatic ways. He didn't yell, not usually. He didn't hit anyone. He was a small business owner from a generation that measured love in labor and inheritance, and in his mind, he loved us both equally. It's just that his version of love for Connor looked like opportunity, and his version of love for me looked like obligation. The summer I turned 26, I was living 40 minutes from Marion Falls, 2 years into my first real analyst job at a regional bank, finally saving real money for the first time in my adult life. My father called on a Tuesday night, which was unusual because my father called on Sundays, after church, like clockwork, and never any other day unless something was wrong. "I need a favor," he said. No hello. That was Gerald. The favor, as he explained it, was small. He was buying a second parcel of land adjacent to the Route 9 warehouse, expanding storage capacity, and his lawyer had told him it would speed up the closing if he had a limited power of attorney on file that let a family member sign paperwork on his behalf if he was traveling during the closing window. "Just in case I'm at the Charlotte Trade Show and papers need a signature," he said. "It's a formality. 10 minutes, Marin. You sign, we get lunch, done." I want to tell you that I read it carefully. I did read it. I read the parcel description, I read the notary block, I read the effective date. What I did not do, what I have thought about more times than I can count in the years since, is ask my father's lawyer directly what the scope of the document actually was, because I trusted, foolishly, that a document limited to a single real estate closing would only ever be used for a single real estate closing. It was a legal document drafted by a lawyer I had never met, on behalf of a father who had never once, not once, given me a reason to think he'd use it for anything else. I signed it in his kitchen. He bought me lunch, like he promised, at the diner on 5th Street. I ordered what I always order, and this matters, so remember it. Black coffee, no cream, no sugar, no lid, because I like to watch the steam. It's a small thing. It grounds me. My father made fun of it once, said only cops and depressed people drink their coffee like that. I've been drinking it that way since I was 22. That lunch, that power of attorney, that Tuesday phone call, none of it seemed important at the time. It was a favor between a father and his daughter. It would sit in a drawer at his lawyer's office for years, unused, unremembered by me, until the day it very much was not unused, and very much was not a favor. For the next several years, my life moved in the direction lives move when you're doing the responsible things. I got promoted. I moved into fraud investigation full-time, the work I was built for, work that rewarded exactly the qualities my father had spent my childhood treating as flaws: suspicion, patience, an eye for the number that doesn't match the story around it. I bought a small house on Larch Avenue, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen I actually liked cooking in, a porch I sat on with that same black coffee most mornings before work. Connor, meanwhile, had joined Voss Building Supply straight out of a business degree he'd finished in 5.5 years, and my father had made him vice president of growth, a title that existed nowhere on an org chart before Connor needed one to put on a business card. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true, and because it matters to what happens later. Connor wasn't stupid. He was charming, likable, good with customers in a way I never was. But he had never once, in the years he worked there, produced a profit and loss statement without help. He had never balanced a budget that wasn't first built for him by the company's outside bookkeeper, a tired, kind woman named Pat who'd worked for my father since before I was born and who, I would later learn, had been quietly worried about the company's finances for at least 2 years before anyone else admitted there was a problem. Family gatherings became a strange ritual during those years. My father would ask Connor about the business in front of everyone, at length, with visible pride. Questions that were really just invitations for Connor to talk about himself. He would ask me, if he asked me anything at all, whether I was seeing anyone, as though that were the only meaningful update a 30-year-old daughter could possibly have. When I mentioned, once, that I'd been asked to testify as an expert witness in a fraud case involving a mid-sized construction firm, my father's exact response was, "Must be nice to get paid to nitpick," Connor laughed. My mother, Elaine, who has spent 40 years agreeing with whatever Gerald says half a second before he finishes saying it, laughed too. Family takes care of family. My father said that same night, raising a glass, toasting Connor's promotion to vice president of operations, a promotion that came, as far as I could tell, with no additional responsibilities and a significant increase in salary. I didn't say anything. I clicked my pen 4 times under the table, a habit that had become so automatic by then I barely noticed I was doing it, and I let the moment pass, the way I'd learned to let so many moments pass. There was one more moment, smaller, that I want to tell you about, because it's the one that should have taught me the lesson I only fully learned later. 2 years before the loan, my father asked me to look over a supplier contract Voss Building Supply was about to sign with a new steel distributor. I did. For free, the way family does favors for family. I found a clause buried in the 4th page that let the supplier adjust pricing retroactively on any order placed within a rolling 90-day window, a clause that could have cost the company tens of thousands of dollars a year if the supplier ever chose to enforce it aggressively. I flagged it. I explained it clearly, in writing, with a specific line number. My father thanked me, called it helpful, and then signed the contract 2 weeks later without asking for the clause to be renegotiated at all. When I asked him about it, months later, after a late invoice showed the exact retroactive adjustment I'd warned him about, he shrugged and said, "Legal stuff always sounds worse than it is." That was the moment I should have understood something essential about my father. It was never that he didn't believe I was right. It was that being right, coming from me, wasn't enough to change what he'd already decided to do. My competence was welcome as long as it stayed decorative. The moment it asked for actual authority over a decision, it became, in his eyes, overthinking. I want to tell you about the trap now, the present-day event that started all of this, but first I need you to understand something that happened 18 months before it. Because this is the part that's hard to admit. I saw a warning sign, and I let my father talk me out of trusting it. It was a Sunday call, right on schedule this time. My father mentioned, almost in passing, that Voss Building Supply was taking out an expansion loan to open a third location in Ridgemont, 40 miles east. He said it the way you'd mention buying a new truck. Casual. Certain. I asked, out of professional habit more than suspicion, how the company's debt-to-revenue ratio looked with a third location added. There was a pause on the line. A real one. "Since when do you audit your own father?" he said. Not a question. A closing statement. I let it go. I told myself it wasn't my business, that a man who'd run a company successfully for 30 years didn't need his daughter, the little auditor, checking his math. That was my first mistake, if you want to call it that, though I've since decided it wasn't really a mistake at all. It was trust. Misplaced, but not foolish to have offered. You're allowed to trust your father. That's not a character flaw. That's just what daughters do, until they're taught otherwise. Stay with me, because here's the part that's hard to admit, and here's where the trap actually gets built. 3 weeks before the dinner where my father called me the dumbest child he ever raised, I got a call from a mortgage broker. I was finally, at 34, putting an offer in on a lake property I'd been saving for since I was 27. The broker's voice had a particular tone I recognized immediately from my own line of work, the tone people use right before they deliver bad news they didn't expect to be delivering. "Miss Voss," she said, "there's an issue with your credit file. There's an outstanding guarantee obligation showing up under your name, a commercial loan, roughly $410,000, currently 60 days past due." I remember exactly where I was standing. My kitchen, coffee in hand, black, no lid. I remember setting the mug down very carefully on the counter, the way you set something down when your hands have started to feel like they belong to someone else. "There's been a mistake," I said. "I've never guaranteed a commercial loan in my life." "The lender has a signed personal guarantee on file," she said, dated 14 months ago. 14 months ago, I was in a hotel room in Denver at a fraud examiner's conference. I have the receipts. I have the boarding passes. I have never, not once, signed a personal guarantee for anyone's commercial debt. I want you to understand what it feels like to do professionally, for other people, for a living. The exact thing you now suddenly have to do for yourself, at 3 a.m, with your own name in the file instead of a stranger's. It is a very particular kind of cold. I pulled my own credit report that night. There it was. A guarantee, a personal guarantee, tied to a commercial loan taken out by Voss Building Supply, LLC, for the Ridgemont expansion, $410,000, my name listed as co-guarantor alongside my father's, my signature notarized on a document I had never seen in my life. I didn't call my father that night. I did what I do. I got quiet, and I got methodical, and I started pulling every document I could legally access. I requested the loan file from the lender through the formal credit dispute process, which gives the consumer, by law, a right to see the documents underlying a disputed debt. It took 11 days to arrive. 11 days of watching that Ridgemont loan sit 60, then 70, then approaching 90 days delinquent. 11 days of my own credit score dropping in real time on a screen I checked more times a day than I'm proud of. When the loan file finally arrived, I read it the way I read every fraud file, cold, patient, looking for the seam. I found it on page 14. The personal guarantee wasn't signed with a new signature at all. It was attached to a limited power of attorney, executed 8 years earlier for what was described in the loan officer's underwriting notes as borrower's adult daughter, acting under valid POA on file, authorized to execute on behalf of family principal in his absence. The power of attorney I signed at 26, in my father's kitchen, over lunch, for a single real estate closing on a single parcel of land. A document I had assumed, reasonably assumed, expired the moment that closing was complete. It hadn't expired. It had no expiration date at all. My father's lawyer had drafted it broad, deliberately broad, I would later learn, and it had simply been sitting active in a file at his lawyer's office for 8 years, waiting. My father hadn't forged a new signature. That would have been almost easier to prove, in some ways, and almost easier to forgive, in the way you can sometimes forgive a single, desperate act. What he'd done instead was worse. He had used a legal instrument I had given him in good faith, once, for one specific purpose, and applied it to a $410,000 guarantee 8 years later, without telling me, without asking me, and without, as far as the file showed, ever intending to. Here's the part that made my hands go cold in a way the credit call hadn't. The loan officer's notes included an internal memo, time-stamped 14 months earlier, the same week I'd been in Denver. My father had called the bank directly and specifically requested that all correspondence regarding the guarantee, including delinquency notices, be sent to the Voss Building Supply business address instead of my personal address. Per family arrangement, daughter travels frequently for work. He had built, deliberately, a system where I would never see a single piece of mail telling me my name was on a loan I didn't know existed until it was already 60 days delinquent and showing up on a mortgage application for my own house. I laid it all out on my kitchen counter that night, the way I lay out evidence for any case, in a numbered sequence, because numbered sequences are the only thing that make chaos feel survivable. Document 1. The original power of attorney, dated 8 years earlier, describing its purpose in a single sentence. For the limited purpose of executing closing documents related to the acquisition of Parcel 114B, Route 9 corridor. Document 2. The closing statement from that original transaction, dated 11 days after the POA was signed, showing the sale had, in fact, closed without my signature ever being needed at all, since my father had been available to sign it himself. That detail alone told me something. The favor I'd been asked for had never even been used for its stated purpose. It had simply been filed away, unused, waiting. Document 3. The commercial loan application for the Ridgemont expansion, dated 14 months before I found any of this, listing me as co-guarantor, with a notary stamp from a notary public I had never met, in a county I had never once set foot in. Document 4. The notary's log, which I requested and received under public records law, showing the in-person notarization had been logged as occurring on a date when my own employer's badge access records, which I also pulled, showed I had swiped into my office building at 7:42 that morning and hadn't left until after 6 that evening, 230 miles from the notary's office. Document 5. The internal memo, the one that still bothers me more than any of the others, requesting that all correspondence on the guarantee be routed to the business address instead of mine, per family arrangement. There was no family arrangement. There had never been a conversation. There was only a sentence my father had said to a loan officer to make a lie sound like a courtesy. 5 documents, 5 dates. 1 signature that had never actually been mine, produced by a notary who had never actually seen my face, built on top of a power of attorney whose real purpose had already been fulfilled and closed out before the ink was even dry. I sat with those 5 documents for a long time that night, not because I didn't understand what they meant. I understood immediately. But because understanding something with your professional brain and accepting it with the part of you that still, at 34, wanted your father to have a reasonable explanation are 2 very different processes, and the second one takes longer, no matter how good. You are at the first. Family takes care of family. I thought about that phrase a lot, standing in my kitchen at 11 at night with a loan file spread across my counter and my coffee gone cold beside it. I want to be very clear about something, because I think it's the most important thing in this whole story. I did not, in that moment, decide to destroy my father. That was never the plan, not then, not later. What I decided, standing in that kitchen, was that I was done being someone things happened to. I was going to become, very quietly, the only variable in this situation that my father hadn't accounted for. The dinner happened 9 days after I received the loan file. My mother called it just a family dinner, the way she calls every gathering that has an agenda just a family dinner. I almost didn't go. 2 days before that dinner, my mother called me. And I want to include this call because I think it shows how these systems recruit everyone in a family, sometimes without the recruiter even fully realizing they're doing it. Your father's worried about the Ridgemont loan, she said, in the careful, sideways tone she uses when she's been asked to deliver a message she doesn't want to be the one delivering. He said something about a paperwork mix-up with the bank. He said it would really help if you just call the loan officer and explain there's no issue on your end. I asked her, directly, whether she knew that paperwork mix-up meant my legal identity had been used without my knowledge to guarantee $410,000 of debt. There was a long pause on the line. I didn't know the number, she said, finally. I just knew he needed help, and you're good at this kind of thing. That sentence, "you're good at this kind of thing," might be the truest summary of my entire childhood that anyone in my family has ever said to me, and my mother said it without any idea of the weight it was carrying. I told her, gently, that I loved her, and that I wasn't going to be calling any loan officer to explain away a fraud that had been committed using my name. She didn't push back. She also didn't ask any more questions, which told me everything I needed to know about how much she already understood and had decided not to look at directly. I almost didn't go to that dinner because I already knew, by then, exactly what was waiting for me there. I decided to go anyway, for one specific reason. I wanted my father to say what he'd done, or at least defend it, in front of witnesses, before I moved forward with the parts of the plan that couldn't be undone. Not because I needed permission. I'd already mailed the revocation. I'd already opened the fraud dispute. But some part of me, the part that had spent 34 years hoping my father might surprise me, wanted to give him one more chance to be the man who says, "I'm sorry, I'll fix it," instead of the man who says you're overthinking a simple family thing. I drove to my aunt's house already knowing, with something close to certainty, which version of him I was going to get. I just needed to hear it out loud, in front of people who couldn't later tell me I'd misunderstood. I'm glad I did, because it gave me the confirmation I needed, in front of witnesses, that my father knew exactly what he'd done. 16 of us at my aunt's dining table, the good china out, my father at the head, expansive, telling a story about a supplier negotiation that made him sound heroic. Connor beside him, nodding along, agreeing with everything, the way he'd learned to do sometime in his 20s and never stopped doing. I waited until dessert. I have my reasons for waiting, and they're not dramatic ones. I wanted my cousin's kids out of the room. I wanted my mother to have finished her second glass of wine, because sober Elaine defends Gerald reflexively, and 2 glasses in Elaine sometimes says true things by accident. Mostly, I wanted to watch my father's face when I asked the question, because faces tell you things files can't. "Dad," I said, "I need to ask you about a guarantee on the Ridgemont loan." The table didn't go silent immediately. It went silent in stages, the way rooms do when people realize something is happening before they understand what it is. "What guarantee?" my father said. Not a question. Gerald doesn't ask questions when he already knows the answer and is buying time. "The $410,000 personal guarantee with my signature on it," I said. "Signed using a power of attorney from 8 years ago. For a real estate closing. That, as far as I can tell, closed in a single afternoon and had nothing to do with a commercial expansion loan." My father's jaw did something small and specific, a tightening I'd seen exactly twice before in my life, both times right before he told a lie he'd already decided to commit to. "That POA was never revoked," he said. "It's valid paper. My lawyer said it's valid paper. It was valid paper for a real estate closing," I said. "You used it to guarantee $410,000 of commercial debt without telling me. It's 60, now probably closer to 70 days past due. It's on my credit report. It almost cost me my own mortgage approval." "We're going to fix it," my father said, waving a hand, already pivoting to the tone he uses when he wants a problem to feel smaller than it is. "It's a cash flow timing issue. That's all. Ridgemont's ramping up. We'll bring it current." "You used my name," I said, without asking me, "to guarantee a debt I didn't know existed. And you had the bank send the notices to a business address specifically so I wouldn't see them." That's when my father's face changed again, from managing a problem to something colder, something I recognized because I'd been on the receiving end of it my whole life. It was the look he gets when a subordinate, in his mind, has forgotten their place. "You want to talk about what people use and don't use," he said, voice climbing just slightly, still not yelling. Gerald doesn't yell in front of family, but sharpening. "I built that company from nothing. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. You think signing one piece of paper for your own family is some kind of sacrifice? Connor's out there every day trying to grow something for this family, and you're sitting at my sister's table auditing me like I'm one of your fraud cases." "I am treating this like a fraud case," I said, "because it is one." The table had gone completely silent by then. My mother had set down her wine glass. Connor was staring at his plate. "You know what your problem has always been, Marin?" my father said. And I want you to hear this next part exactly the way he said it, because it's the line that gives this story its title. "You think being smart with numbers makes you smart about people. It doesn't. You've always been the one who overthinks everything, second guesses everything, turns every simple family thing into a federal case. Honestly? You are the dumbest child I ever raised, because you had every advantage your brother didn't, and you spent it all learning how to distrust your own family instead of learning how to build something with it." Nobody said anything. My aunt refilled a water glass that didn't need refilling, just to have something to do with her hands. Connor still hadn't looked up. I clicked my pen 4 times. I didn't even realize I had a pen in my bag until my hand found it, an old habit reaching for an old comfort. "Okay," I said. "That was it. That was the whole response. I didn't defend myself. I didn't list my accomplishments." I didn't cry, though I'll admit, in the car afterward, alone, I cried for exactly 4 minutes, and then I stopped, and then I opened my laptop on the passenger seat before I'd even started the engine. Here's what my father did not know, sitting at that table feeling like he'd won. I had already, 3 days earlier, before that dinner ever happened, filed a formal written revocation of the power of attorney with my father's lawyer's office, sent by certified mail with return receipt, and filed a duplicate revocation directly with the county recorder's office, a matter of public record from that point forward. I had already opened a formal fraud dispute with the lender, using my professional credentials to request an internal investigation into how a guarantee had been executed on a POA whose stated purpose, in writing, had nothing to do with commercial lending. I had already spoken, briefly, off the record, with a consumer protection attorney named Priya Nadeem, who specializes in exactly this kind of identity-adjacent financial harm, and who had listened to my file summary and said 4 words I will remember for the rest of my life. "You have a case." I want to tell you about that call with Priya, because I think it's the moment the plan actually became a plan instead of just a wound I was staring at. She asked me to walk her through the 5 documents in order, the same order I'd laid them out on my counter, and she stopped me at document 4, the notary log, and asked me to read the notary's registration number out loud twice. "That's not a small thing," she said. "A notary who logs an in-person acknowledgement for someone who was 230 miles away isn't just sloppy. That's either notary fraud on their end, or someone gave them information they had no way of verifying and they didn't check. Either way, it breaks the chain that makes this document enforceable against you." She explained the mechanics plainly, the way I try to explain fraud mechanics to clients who've never had to think about this before. A power of attorney doesn't have unlimited life just because nobody thought to kill it. Its authority is bound by the purpose stated inside it, and a court, if it ever came to that, would almost certainly find that authority to execute a single real estate closing did not stretch, 8 years later, to guaranteeing $410,000 of unrelated commercial debt. "You can revoke it right now, today, regardless of what it was used for," she told me. And separately, you can and should report what was done with it. Those are 2 different fights. You don't have to decide today whether you want to have the second one, but you need to win the first one immediately, because every day that instrument sits active is a day someone can use it again. I remember writing that sentence down on a legal pad, underlining it twice. Every day that instrument sits active is a day someone can use it again. That was the moment the fear in my chest turned into something more useful. Not anger, exactly, though there was anger in it. Urgency. The kind of urgency I recognize from every case I've ever worked, the specific feeling of realizing that the clock started running before you even knew there was a clock. My father thought he'd delivered a verdict on me at that dinner table. What he'd actually done was hand me the final piece of confirmation I needed in front of 11 witnesses that he knew precisely what he'd done and felt no need to apologize for it. He'd said, out loud, in front of my mother, my aunt, my cousins, and my brother, that using my identity without my knowledge was a simple family thing. That sentence would matter more than he could possibly have imagined. Stay with me, because what happens over the next 10 days is the part I think about most. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I promise you, the moment this trap fully closes is worth waiting for. I want to walk you through what I actually did, because I think the how matters as much as the what. This wasn't rage. This was a case file, and I built it the way I build every case file, methodically, with dates. First, the revocation. A power of attorney can typically be revoked unilaterally by the principal at any time, in writing, and once properly delivered and recorded, third parties dealing with the former agent going forward do so at their own risk. My revocation was airtight, dated, notarized, delivered by certified mail with a signature confirmation I kept in a folder on my desk. From the date of that revocation forward, my father had no further authority to act on my behalf under that instrument, for anything. Second, the fraud dispute. I submitted, through the lender's formal dispute process, a written statement asserting that the guarantee had been executed outside the stated scope of the underlying power of attorney, along with the original real estate closing documents showing the POA's explicit, narrow purpose. Banks do not enjoy discovering that a guarantee on a delinquent commercial loan might not survive a legal challenge. A $410,000 guarantee that turns out to be unenforceable isn't just a paperwork problem for a lender. It's a risk rating problem, a compliance problem, and depending on how the underwriting was handled internally, potentially a problem for the loan officer who approved it without confirming the POA's actual scope. Third, and this is the piece my father genuinely never saw coming, I filed an identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission and a corresponding police report with the Marion Falls Police Department. I want to be honest with you about how I felt doing this, because this is the story's turning point, and I don't want to pretend it was easy. It felt enormous. It felt like crossing a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. But I kept coming back to one fact, the fact I'd built my entire career around respecting. The document doesn't care about intentions. The document only shows what was done, and what was done was that my legal identity had been used, without my knowledge or consent, to expose me to over $400,000 of liability I never agreed to carry. There was a ticking clock running underneath all of this, and it wasn't one I set. It was the lender's own cure period. Under the terms of the commercial loan, once a guarantee dispute of this nature is formally raised and a fraud investigation is opened by either party, the lender is required to either resolve the guarantee's validity or restructure the loan terms within a defined window, in this case, 10 business days, before the loan is automatically escalated to their Special Assets and Workout Division, the department that handles loans a bank no longer expects to collect on the original terms. I knew this because I'd seen it happen from the other side of the desk dozens of times to other people's families, never once imagining I'd be watching the same clock run down on my own. 10 days. My father didn't know the clock existed. He thought he had a cash flow timing issue, as he'd called it at dinner, something he could smooth over with Connor's charm and a phone call to a loan officer he'd known for years. He had no idea that the loan officer's own supervisor had already flagged the file for review, or that the fraud dispute I'd filed had triggered a mandatory internal audit of every guarantee that officer had approved using a power of attorney in the last 3 years, because it turned out, and I only learned this later, mine was not the only file with a problem. On day 6 of the 10-day window, my father called me. Not a Sunday, a Wednesday, which meant, by his own rules, something was wrong. "Marin, what did you do?" he said. Not a question, again. Gerald doesn't ask when he's afraid of the answer. "I revoked the power of attorney and disputed a fraudulent guarantee," I said. "Those are two very different things from what you might have heard." "The bank is calling this a fraud case," he said. And for the first time in the conversation, in maybe the first time in years, his voice had a crack in it I didn't recognize. "They're saying they might call the entire note. Do you understand what that means for this family? For your brother's job? For your mother? For 30 years of my life?" "I understand exactly what it means," I said. "I understand it better than almost anyone you could have called. You're really going to let this company go under over a piece of paper," he said. "You used my identity, Dad," I said, "and this is the only time in the entire 10 days that my voice came close to breaking, and I let it, once, because I think it's important for him to know that composure isn't the same thing as not caring. You used it deliberately. You had the mail redirected, so I'd never see it. And when I confronted you about it at Aunt Carol's table, in front of everyone, you told me it was a simple family thing and called me the dumbest child you ever raised. I'm not letting anything go under. You built this. I just stopped protecting you from it." He hung up on me. That was the last conversation we had for 11 weeks. On day 9, the fraud investigation the lender had launched into their own loan officer's file confirmed, in writing, what I already knew. The guarantee had been executed outside the documented scope of the power of attorney and was deemed unenforceable against me. My name was formally removed from the loan. The full $410,000 reverted to being solely my father's personal obligation as sole guarantor, exactly as it should have been from the beginning, exactly as it would have been if he'd simply asked me to co-sign like an adult instead of quietly repurposing an 8-year-old document. On day 10, the loan, now carrying only Gerald Voss's name and roughly 91 days delinquent, with a special assets flag and an active internal fraud note attached to the file, was formally escalated. The bank called the note, not partially, not with a grace period. in full. $410,000 due under the loan's own default acceleration clause within 30 days, or the bank would move to place a lien against Voss Building Supply's commercial property, including the original 2 locations that had nothing to do with Ridgemont at all. I found out it happened because Pat, the company's longtime bookkeeper, called me. Not my father. Pat. She'd worked for my family for over 20 years. And I think in some quiet way, she'd been waiting a long time for someone in that building to actually look at the numbers the way they deserve to be looked at. "Marin," she said, "I don't know what you did, but the bank called the whole loan due today. Your father found out in front of the entire Ridgemont crew. He had to walk out of a site meeting to take the call. Here is the moment the plan publicly failed, in front of witnesses, exactly the way these things tend to. Not because I orchestrated a confrontation. I didn't need to. I had simply stopped shielding my father from the consequences of a system he had built to depend on my silence. And the system, once I removed myself from it, collapsed under its own weight, in public, in front of the crew he'd hired specifically to be impressed by him." Pat told me later, and I have no reason to doubt her, that Connor had been standing right there when the call came in, that he'd asked their father what was happening, and that Gerald had said, in front of 6 employees, "Ask your sister." Connor had no idea what that meant. Nobody at that site had any idea what that meant. All they knew was that the man who'd built the company, the man whose name was on the sign, had gone pale, walked to his truck, and driven away without finishing the meeting. Pat gave me one more detail I've never been able to shake, not out of cruelty in the telling, just as a fact she thought I should have. The Ridgemont site that day had a small ceremony planned, nothing formal, just a handful of local contractors and 2 men from the County Economic Development Office who'd come out to see the progress on what was supposed to become the 3rd Voss location, a symbol, in a town like Marion Falls, of a family business still growing in an era when most of them were shrinking. My father had been in the middle of describing his 30-year plan for the site, gesturing at empty graded dirt like it was already a warehouse, when his phone rang. He stepped away to take it, the way people do when they think a call is routine, and Pat said she watched his shoulders change before he'd said a single word back into the phone, the particular posture of a man listening to a sentence he cannot argue with. He came back to the group 2 minutes later, thanked everyone for coming, and left without finishing his own presentation, in front of the exact audience he'd built his whole identity around impressing. I think about that detail more than almost any other part of this story, because it wasn't a confrontation I staged. It wasn't a dramatic reveal in a courtroom or a shouting match at a table. It was simply the truth arriving on schedule, in the most ordinary way possible, a phone call in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and my father's own carefully built reputation dissolving in front of the very people it existed for. I felt strange in the days after Pat told me that story. Not triumphant, though I want to be honest that there was a version of me, a smaller, younger version, still standing in that kitchen at 12 years old holding a second-place ribbon nobody wanted to look at, that felt something like relief. Mostly what I felt was the specific exhaustion that comes after finishing a case. Any case. The flat quiet that arrives once the adrenaline of building an argument has nowhere left to go because the argument has already won. What happened over the following weeks cascaded the way I knew, professionally. These things tend to cascade. Though I want to be honest, it was still strange to watch it happen to people I'd grown up with. Within 2 weeks, Voss Building Supply was in active negotiations with the bank's workout division, the kind of negotiations where a business either restructures under punishing new terms or begins the process of an orderly wind down. My father, facing a demand for $410,000 in 30 days with no realistic way to raise it, had to put the Ridgemont property, which had never opened, up for a distressed sale. It sold, 6 weeks later, for 60 cents on the dollar, enough to cover the majority of the guarantee, but not all of it. Within a month, Connor's title, Vice President of Growth, quietly disappeared from the company website, replaced by a much smaller job description that more accurately reflected what he'd actually been doing all along, and his salary, I learned much later from my mother, was cut by nearly half as the company entered survival mode. I want to be clear, I never wished that on Connor specifically. He wasn't the architect of any of this. He was a beneficiary of it, which is a different thing, but the collapse didn't ask the difference before it landed on him too. Within 2 months, my father had personally guaranteed a restructured loan, this time using his own home as collateral, a decision my mother told me about in a phone call where her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "He's putting the house up," she said. 30 years of paying that off, and he's putting it up. The cascade kept moving in ways I mostly heard about secondhand, in fragments, from my mother's phone calls and Pat's occasional updates, because I had made a deliberate choice not to insert myself into the daily unfolding of it. In week 3, the Ridgemont site, half-graded, chain-linked, sat listed with a commercial broker who my father, according to Pat, argued with for 2 days over the asking price before finally accepting it was worth less finished than he'd budgeted for it unfinished. In week 5, 2 of the company's longtime supplier relationships, the kind built over decades on handshake trust, quietly shortened their payment terms from net 60 to net 15, a change that sounds small on paper and is, in practice, the industry's polite way of saying, "We've heard things and we'd like to get paid faster from now on." In week 7, Connor, according to my mother, had started coming home most nights well after dark. Not from ambition anymore, but because the company was down 2 warehouse staff it could no longer afford to replace. And the vice president of growth had found himself, for the first time in his working life, actually loading pallets onto trucks himself, which my mother relayed to me with a kind of bewildered pride, as though hard labor were a personality transplant rather than simply what happens when there's no longer money to pay someone else to do it. In week 9, the restructured loan finally closed. My father's house pledged as collateral alongside what remained of the business's real property, a document I did not review, was not asked to review, and did not offer to review, because I had learned, finally, the difference between refusing to help and refusing to volunteer. I didn't call him. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to the story. I didn't reach out during those 2 months, not because I was enjoying watching it happen. I want to be clear I took no pleasure in any of it, but because I had learned, finally, at 34 years old, that showing up uninvited to fix things was exactly the pattern that had put my name on a $410,000 guarantee in the first place. I had spent my whole life being the fixer nobody asked to be a partner. I wasn't going to volunteer for that role again just because the crisis had gotten bigger. 3 months, almost to the day, after that dinner at Aunt Carol's table, my father called my office, not my cell. My office line? The number listed on the bank's public directory, which meant he'd had to look it up, which meant he hadn't called it in years. My assistant told me a Gerald Voss was in the lobby without an appointment. I remember sitting at my desk for a long moment, coffee in hand, black, no lid, watching the steam, before I told her to send him back. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, though maybe that too, but smaller in the way people look when the version of themselves they'd built their whole identity around has stopped being available to them. He was holding a manila folder against his chest, the way you hold something you're afraid someone will take from you before you're ready to give it up. "I need your help," he said, and I want you to notice he didn't say sorry first. Even then. Even sitting across from a daughter he'd humiliated at a dinner table 3 months earlier, the first words out of his mouth were about what he needed. "With what?" I said, though I already knew. "The workout division wants a forensic accounting review before they'll finalize the restructure," he said. "They want proof the company's numbers are clean going forward. I don't have anyone who can do that at the level they're asking for. Pat's good, but this needs someone like you." I let the silence sit there for a moment. I've learned that silence does more work than most sentences. "You called me the dumbest child you ever raised," I said, in front of 16 people, for the crime of asking why my name was on a debt I never agreed to. And now you're in my office asking the dumbest child to save the company. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked down at the folder in his lap. "I'm not saying it to be cruel," I said. "I'm saying it because I need you to actually hear it before we talk about anything else." "I know," he said, quietly, and it was the quietest I had heard my father's voice in my entire life. "I've had 3 months to think about what I said. I've had 3 months to think about a lot of things." He opened the manila folder in his lap, and for a moment I thought he was going to hand me some kind of prepared apology, a speech he'd rehearsed in the truck on the way over. Instead, it was just the workout division's letter, the one demanding the forensic review, 3 pages of banking language he clearly hadn't fully understood, sticky notes and his own handwriting marking phrases he wanted explained. I looked at those sticky notes longer than I probably needed to. 8 of them. 8 places where my father, a man who had run a company for 30 years, had gotten stuck on language he didn't have anyone else to ask about because the one person in his life who spoke that language fluently was the daughter he'd spent 3 months not speaking to. Why now? I asked him. Why not call Connor's business school professors, or your lawyer, or anyone else you'd normally call first? He was quiet for a moment. Because none of them would tell me the truth if it made me look bad, he said. You're the only person I've ever known who'll tell me exactly what's wrong, even when it costs you something to say it. I spent a long time treating that like an insult. I don't anymore. It wasn't a full apology. I noticed that, and I let myself notice it without pretending it was more than it was. But it was, for my father, close to the most honest sentence I had ever heard him say, and I decided, sitting there with my coffee going cold, that it was enough to build the next part on, even if it wasn't enough to erase the part that came before it. Here's what I want you to understand about what happened next, because I think it's the part most people expect to go one of 2 ways, and it went a third way instead. I didn't refuse him. I also didn't rescue him, not the way he was hoping. I did what I do. I laid out terms, the way I'd lay out terms for any client, because that's what he was now, whether either of us was ready to say it that way. I'll do the review, I said, at my normal consulting rate, with a signed engagement letter, the same as any other client. Not as a favor, not as family taking care of family. As a professional service you're paying for, in full, on the same terms anyone else would get. That seems, he started, and I watched him decide, visibly, not to finish that sentence with the word harsh. It seems fair, I said instead, finishing it for him. Which is more than what I got, he agreed. He signed the engagement letter 2 days later, in my office, at my desk, no golf polo, no head of a family table, just a client signing a form. The review took 6 weeks. I found, in the process, 3 other instances where Connor had approved vendor payments without the documentation my father's own internal policy required. Sloppy, not criminal. The kind of thing that happens when someone is handed authority they were never actually trained to carry. I flagged all 3. I put them in writing, the same as I would for any client. No softer language, because the client happened to be my father. I also, and this took real deliberation on my part, offered him something else, something separate from the paid engagement. Not forgiveness exactly. I'm not sure I'd fully arrived at forgiveness by then, and I don't think you have to pretend you have to be at peace with a person. I offered him one dinner, at my house, my kitchen, on my terms. Just the 2 of us. My mother could come the next time, if there was a next time. Connor could come the time after that. I told him the rules before he arrived. No talk of the company unless I raised it. No mention of the word family unless he meant it as something other than a leash. And if he called me stupid, or careless, or anything resembling the dumbest child he ever raised, one more time, for any reason, the dinner would end, and I would not offer another one. I remember standing in my kitchen an hour before he arrived, chopping vegetables. I didn't strictly need to chop that carefully, and thinking about how strange it was to be nervous about hosting my own father. 34 years old, and I was setting rules for a dinner the way I'd set terms for a client engagement, because that, I'd realized somewhere in the previous 3 months, was the only version of a relationship with him I could actually survive without losing the parts of myself I'd fought hardest to build. I put out 2 mugs before he arrived, out of habit, and then put one away, because my father drinks his coffee with cream and 2 sugars, and some accommodations. I decided standing there in my kitchen could still be made without meaning I'd forgotten anything at all. He came. He sat at my kitchen table, the one I bought with money he never helped me earn, and he was quiet for most of the meal. And near the end, he said something I think about often. I spent so long measuring what Connor and I built that I never noticed what you built without any help from me at all. I didn't cry. Not that night. I clicked my pen 4 times, out of habit, and I said, I noticed. I want to tell you about the rest of that dinner, because I think the specifics matter more than the summary. He asked, for what I believe was genuinely the first time in my adult life, what a normal week actually looked like for me. Not as a segue into a story about Connor, not as a comparison, just as an actual question with room for an actual answer. I told him about a case I'd closed the month before, a small manufacturing company whose bookkeeper had been quietly skimming for 6 years, using a technique so patient and so small each time that nobody noticed until the totals finally added up wrong by a number too large to explain away. My father listened. He asked a follow-up question. It was such a small thing, a father asking his daughter a follow-up question about her work, and it undid something in my chest I hadn't realized was still braced. He also, that night, told me something about the notary log I hadn't fully understood before. The notary my father's lawyer had used for the guarantee wasn't a stranger picked at random. It was someone the lawyer's office used routinely for volume paperwork, someone who, according to the state's later disciplinary inquiry, had a habit of pre-signing acknowledgement stamps for documents the lawyer's office would confirm by phone rather than in person, a practice that was, as it turned out, a violation serious enough that the notary's commission was eventually suspended. My father hadn't known that detail when he'd asked his lawyer to draw up the guarantee. He'd assumed, the way people assume when they want an inconvenient process to move quickly, that everyone in the chain was doing their job by the book. I don't say this to excuse what he did. The decision to reach for an 8-year-old, single-purpose power of attorney instead of simply calling his own daughter and asking her directly was his and his alone, made with full knowledge that asking me directly meant risking a no he wasn't prepared to hear. But I think it's honest to say that the fraud wasn't purely his invention. It was his choice, executed through a system that made the choice easier than it should have been to make. And I think understanding that helped me separate, eventually, my father, the man from my father, the mechanism he'd used against me. Here's what I learned from all of this, and I say this not as a lesson wrapped in a bow, but as something I actually had to live to understand. Being the responsible one in a family doesn't make you invisible by accident. Sometimes it makes you invisible on purpose, because a family that depends on your competence has every incentive to never ask what that competence is costing you. Nobody protects the fixer, because the fixer has spent a lifetime demonstrating that she doesn't need protecting. I learned something else, too, something I didn't expect to learn. Justice, real justice, the kind that actually changes something instead of just making you feel briefly better, is almost never loud. It doesn't look like a speech at a dinner table. It doesn't look like slamming a door or screaming the truth until someone finally hears it. It looks like a certified letter. It looks like a public records request. It looks like 5 documents laid out in order on a kitchen counter at 11 at night, and the discipline to let the clock you didn't set run all the way down instead of rescuing the person who built the trap you were standing in. Volume was never the thing my family respected. Systems were. So I stopped raising my voice, and I started raising my documentation, and it turned out that was the only language in that house anyone had ever truly been unable to argue with. I learned that forgiveness and accountability aren't opposites, and you don't have to pick one at the expense of the other. I forgave my father, eventually, in the specific and limited way that means I let him back into my kitchen. I did not forgive the version of events where none of this ever needed to be litigated, revoked, and reported in the first place. Both of those things are true at once. I think a lot of people are taught that real forgiveness means pretending the damage didn't happen, and I don't believe that anymore, if I ever did. Real forgiveness, the kind that actually holds, is the kind you can offer with your eyes open, with the documentation still filed, with the terms still in writing, because it's built on truth instead of built on top of it. Here's what I learned from all of this. And I say this not as a lesson wrapped in a bow, but as something I actually had to live to understand. Being the responsible one in a family doesn't make you invisible by accident. Sometimes it makes you invisible on purpose, because a family that depends on your competence has every incentive to never ask what that competence is costing you. Nobody protects the fixer, because the fixer has spent a lifetime demonstrating that she doesn't need protecting. I learned that quiet isn't the same as passive. I learned that the calmest person in the room is very often the most dangerous one to underestimate. Not because she wants to destroy anything, but because she's the only one still reading the fine print while everyone else is busy making promises they haven't checked the math on. And I learned that you can love your family, genuinely, and still refuse to let family takes care of family mean that you're the only one doing the taking care. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one who reads the fine print while everyone else just trusts, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me what your family's version of family takes care of family sounds like. Share this with someone who needs to hear that competence and composure are not the same thing as being taken advantage of. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming, and I promise you, the quiet ones always land the hardest. I'll see you in the next one.